Okay, so I'm really, really happy to be joined by AP, who is South African born, London based. He is a Bulls fan, and he has now been promoted to our resident South African expert. So, AP, really, really pleased to have you on. Thanks very much for giving up your time as we kind of preview the upcoming Bristol versus Bulls game. But before we talk about that, I thought it'd be really nice if you could just give our listeners a little bit of a general overview about the Bulls, right down to the basics, where they're from, what their history is, and perhaps I think we were talking off air before, but there's a bit of a parallel with the way that Bristol Bears have developed as well.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Pete. Really, really pleased to be here and to get a chance to chat to you guys. But yeah, jumping straight into it, just to give you sort of a general background on the Bulls and where they're from. So for those that don't know, the Bulls are one of what could be described as South Africa's four major teams, along with the Lions, the Stormers, and the Sharks. They are based in Pretoria, which is the capital of South Africa. And they have a very long and storied and pretty proud history, albeit, of course, I'd say that being a Bulls fan. But they're sort of seen alongside the Stormers as being the two premier South African domestic rugby sides. And probably that trend continues until today, where they are the best two, really. To sort of touch upon what you mentioned with regards to the parallels that they might have with Bristol, I think, as we were saying, we were speaking off air about actually the Jake White, Pat Lam parallel, because I think what's quite interesting is when you talk to fan bases from both sides at the moment, it's the feeling of, we brought in this sort of almost maverick coach who's got these brilliant ideas and is trying to lead an attacking revolution in the way that the team plays. And that's been very effective for the first 2-3 seasons. But now teams have almost started to work it out, and the fan base is a little bit unhappy in terms of how both sides are performing. The Bulls are sort of mid-table in the URC at the moment. Bristol obviously not performing as well this year in the Prem. So there's a lot hinging on this game in many ways for both sets of fan bases, which I think makes it quite a spicy encounter outside of obviously the occasion.
Yeah, you mentioned the URC. What I understand they did quite well early on. When did they join? When, I actually don't know when the URC actually was created, but when did the Bulls actually join the URC, and what's their record generally been since then?
So the URC is pretty much still in its infancy. I should say that the Bulls will be very proud to say that they are the only South African team to have won Super Rugby. They won Super Rugby 3 times, and in their heyday, 2007 to 2010, they won it 3 times, including back-to-back 2009 and 2010. And that was the era of, Victor Matfield, Fourie du Preez, Bakkie Spuita, basically all the core mainstays of the Springbok team from that era were all Bulls players. Then they went into the wilderness for about 10 years. And although they had a series of very impressive rosters, you think of your Andre Pollards and, Jesse Creel played for them and the host of other players, they just never recaptured that success. Cycled through coaches every 2 seasons, could never really hit the heights of what their roster demanded. Then Jake White came in, and that sort of coincided the year or 2 before the URC. The URC started 2 seasons ago, it's now into its 3rd season currently. And in that first season, somewhat against expectations, they made it to the final. It was an all South African final, and then lost to their big rivals, the Stormers, in the final, which was a fairly closely contested game in Cape Town. So I'd say that, as I said, I mentioned it before, the Bulls are a very proud team, and they'll look at that period of 2010 to about 2020 as a pretty black decade in terms of, a dearth of trophies, pretty uncompetitive, struggling for an identity. And they've started to hit their straps. And I think their first season, they probably overperformed expectations. First season, URC, so 21, 22. Then 22, 23, I think it was that typical second season syndrome where they sort of dropped off and never hit those heights again. And then after that, I think, we as a side, or the coaches, sat down and made a few alterations, brought in a heck of a lot of players and, coaching personnel as well. And so we're starting to see the fruits of that in this later season, but they're not quite there yet.
Well, that's really interesting, actually. We do like to add a bit of education on our podcast, so I think a bit of modern history goes down well. Thinking about this season, how have they been getting on? I believe the last game they played was the 23rd of December, so they've had a bit of a break since then. But how have they got on in the URC so far, and also how do they get on in their two Champions Cup games?
Well, I think what's interesting for the Bulls is that they've managed to make Loftus, which is their home stadium in Pretoria, an absolute fortress. I think they're unbeaten at home this season, and they faced some pretty serious sides, including a stacked Saracen side that came over and were pretty much played off the park for, I'd say, about 60 minutes in that game. I think the scoreline flatters Sarries, how that one finished. So what they've done well in the URC this season is they've won all their home games and done so very, very convincingly. They currently have the highest points difference in the league. So at home, they've been absolutely brutal. Where they've struggled is on the road. They struggle in their opening sort of salvo in the URC. They go on a 4-week tour. I think they managed to win 2 games, which was actually a fairly decent return, and the other 2 weren't very competitive. And then obviously in their away game to Lyon in the Champions Cup, they unfortunately went down by 1 point there as well. So on the whole, they don't tend to travel very well, and historically haven't. This season, it's slightly bucked the trend, but not to the extent where I'd say they'd be going into the Bristol game brimming with confidence.
So, I mean, that leads us on nicely to think about the game next Saturday. I mean, it's going to be interesting because it's a 3 o'clock kickoff at Ashton Gate, and I'm not sure there'll be a huge crowd there for various reasons, because they're giving away buy one get one free tickets and stuff like that at the moment for season ticket holders. So it could be interesting, and it is a really nice stadium, and we always have a suspicion that it's quite good for teams to play well at because it's quite comfortable. So thinking about that, I mean, what sort of team do you think us Bristol Bears fans are likely to see, and are there any, I mean, what names will we have heard of, or and likewise, are there any kind of unheralded players that we should be more wary of, perhaps?
So this is the $1 million question, and I have to be honest with you, it's been very, very difficult to predict what Bulls team would come out this season. Everyone sort of expected them to send a completely second-string side to Lyon, and then they didn't. Or rather, players that people assumed were second-string players were then selected for their, grudge match against the Stormers, where they very much went, all guns blazing. So it's very tricky to sort of speculate about exactly what type of team's going to go out. But broadly speaking, I suppose it might be worth giving people an idea of the types of names you might have heard and who do play for the Bulls. So, I mean, people would have heard of Willie LaRue. He's now a Bulls player as of this season. Kurtley Aronson, Caden Moody, 2 of the rising stars in South Africa in the back 3 on the wing. They are Bulls players, and I wouldn't be surprised if both or at least one of them were involved. Then thinking some other names, I suppose Premiership viewers would be familiar with. Wilco Low, who played for Harlequins. He's now at the Bulls, as is Ocker van der Merwe, brother of Duan, who played for Sale at hooker.
Well, yeah, we know him.
So they've really they've really reinforced their side with a few signings on the, as I said, after last season. That's where you had Akker, Wilco, Willie LaRue, these types of guys come in. Johan Goosen may be familiar to some Premiership viewers who he was at Montpellier for a very long period of time. So trying to guess what we're likely to see in terms of this weekend coming, as I said, it's a bit of a fool's errand to try and preempt. But what I suspect we will see is there's some very important players for the Bulls who are lacking match time because they've been injured and were due to come back around about that Stormers game on the 23rd of December. So will very much now be fit and probably raring to go. So that includes captain Ron Nokia, who is very much touted as a future, multi-capped Springbok. He's incredibly talented lock, second rower. So he's a guy I'd very much say is one to look out for. Massive engine on him. And then in the back row, you've got a guy like Cameron Honeycomb, who sort of caught the headlines a lot. I know that Bristol, given its proximity to Wales, that you probably get quite a lot of influx of Welsh fans, and he's one that is obviously Welsh qualified as well. So for the Welsh Bristol Bears fans, that might be one of particular interest. And then, just more broadly, I think the Bulls' backline is perhaps slightly unheralded, but it's a very exciting backline. At 9, you're almost likely to see probably Zach Berg or Keegan Ioannis. I could sort of spend all day sort of speculating with names. I think more helpful perhaps is just to give you an idea of the type of rugby the Bulls play.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, do they have one sort of game plan, or are they quite adaptable? So.
Well, I think this sort of touches on what I said previously when, in their heyday, 07 to 2010, a team that has, Bakkies Buerta in is going to play a particular style of rugby. And they were sort of known as the bully boy team in South Africa. heavily forward dominant, just lots and lots of pick and goes, rolling mauls, set piece orientated, strong kicking game for Andre-Pierre as the sort of general commanding it, Mornay Stain as well. So you can imagine that type of style. In the Jake White era, they've completely inverted that, I'd say, and they've now become much more attacking focused. And that's why I think there's parallels there with the type of rugby that Bristol try and play, an offloading game, keep ball. Hence why they've scored so many tries, hence why they've currently got the highest points difference in the league. So I think, what you're likely to see is a team that plays with a lot of ambition in all conditions. I mean, the game against Lyon that we alluded to, they scored some absolutely stunning tries in that game and were willing to attack from within their 22 regularly. And it was pretty torrid conditions. It was freezing. It was hammering it down. So come what may, and hopefully it stays dry for the weekend. But I think that they won't be deterred by the conditions. And I mean, you mentioned that it's a gorgeous place to go play at Ashton Gate as well. So we could be in for some fireworks.
Yeah, and we're going to go into the game with a little bit of confidence after our gritty win at Sale. So yeah, no, it sounds great. I mean, that is a fantastic summary for us. I mean, as I said, it's the first time we played a South African club side in a competition. So I really appreciate that, and hopefully it's going to be a really good game. If both teams turn up, it sounds like there could be a few metaphorical, and if we're lucky, literal fireworks at Ashton Gate on Saturday. Well, look, I really appreciate you giving up your time. It's been great. You now have been promoted to our regular South African expert. So if we need to talk to you again, I hope you'd be willing to come on and chat to us if we play another South African side in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been brilliant chatting.